The morning sun rises slowly over the 13 colonies. Its golden light spreads across rolling fields, quiet rivers, and small wooden towns. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, birds chirp their morning songs, and somewhere a rooster crows with an attitude like it owns the day. Life seems peaceful here, almost sleepy, but beneath the calm something is stirring. Something small, quiet, but powerful enough to eventually shake the world. Before the rumble of rebellion, before the echo of muskets, and before the words, "No taxation without representation," ever slipped from someone's lips, the 13 colonies were, well, pretty much just people trying to get by. And by people, I mean farmers, shopkeepers, sailors, and tavern-goers. Life was slow, sometimes hard, often repetitive. But there was a rhythm to it. The rhythm of planting, harvesting, trading, and occasionally gossiping at the local tavern. The colonial social media of the time, except much slower and with stronger L. Picture a small town in Massachusetts. Wooden houses with steep roofs stand on dirt streets that get muddy with even the tiniest rain. Smoke curls from the chimneys, carrying the smell of baking bread or roasting meat. Chickens wander freely, and children chase them, squealing with laughter. Farmers trudge through fields, their boots thick with mud, while cows chew the morning grass, completely unconcerned about the world beyond the fence. In the towns, shopkeepers sweep doorsteps, polishing signs that creak when the wind blows. Life seems simple, cozy, almost like a storybook. But like most good stories, there's a hint of tension under the surface. You see, the colonies were technically under Britain's rule. They owed allegiance to a king who lived far across the ocean, somewhere in London, wearing wigs that probably cost more than a year's wages for a small town farmer. And while Britain's presence was distant, mostly letters, laws, and taxes sent from across the Atlantic, it was there. Sometimes felt, sometimes ignored, but always looming like a quiet shadow. Colonists paid taxes on paper, on tea, on stamps, even on playing cards, and while some grumbled quietly, most carried on. Life had to go on. Crops had to grow, dinners had to be cooked, children had to be raised. Taxes were annoying, sure, but they were part of the rhythm, just like the rooster's morning crow or the creak of a cartwheel over cobblestones. Yet, not everyone ignored the rumblings. Slowly, little pockets of discontent were forming. People whispered in taverns about unfair laws and heavy-handed governors. Farmers muttered about trading restrictions that made selling their goods harder. Merchants frowned at tariffs and shipping taxes. Even housewives grumbled, politely, about imported goods that suddenly cost more. At first it was small, almost imperceptible, a quiet grumble here, a worried look there. But it was growing, like yeast in bread dough. History, as some wise person once said, doesn't explode overnight, it brews. Slowly, quietly, until it's ready to rise. Let's take a moment to zoom in on the everyday life of a colonist. Imagine Sarah, a woman in her 20s, living on a modest farm in Pennsylvania. She wakes early, milking cows, feeding chickens, and lighting the hearth before the sun has fully risen. Her fingers are raw from the cold, but she hums a tune while kneading bread. Occasionally, she pauses to shoo a goat away from her vegetables. Goats are like tiny chaos machines, really. She's part of a network of people who depend on one another, Neighbors trade milk for eggs, wood for flour, or gossip for advice. And yes, gossip was very important. Without it, how else would you know which neighbor's cow was particularly mischievous that week? Meanwhile, across the colonies, Thomas, a young blacksmith, hammers away at glowing iron in his forge. Sparks fly into the cool morning air. The rhythmic clang of hammer on metal echoes through the street. He might mutter under his breath about the rising price of iron or a new tax on imported tools, but mostly he focuses on shaping the metal into horseshoes, nails, and the occasional fancy gate latch that someone's trying to impress their in-laws with. Life is hard, yes, but satisfying. You get a lot done with your hands. And occasionally, if you're lucky, you get a bit of humor. Like when the mayor's hat blows into the mud, and everyone pretends it's a fashion statement. In towns along the coast, the port is a hub of activity. Ships creak as they tie to docks, sailors shout over the waves, and merchants haggle over goods from faraway places. Sugar from the Caribbean, tea from India, cloth from England. Trade is lifeblood, but it's also where tensions quietly build. Restrictions on trade, which the Crown thinks are reasonable, of course, make merchants grumble. Ship captains whisper about smuggling, quietly bypassing the rules to make a few extra coins. And while it's all low-key, this constant friction between everyday life and distant authority plants the seeds for future rebellion. Even the children are part of this world. They run barefoot through dirt streets, climb fences, play games that seem simple but teach lessons of balance, strategy, and teamwork. They don't yet know that one day their world will change dramatically. But in these quiet mornings, they are learning resilience, curiosity, and, occasionally, how to avoid a particularly angry goose. And these small lessons matter because history is made of people, ordinary people, doing ordinary things day by day, year by year. So here we are, at the dawn of something big. It's not loud, it's not dramatic yet. There are no battles to recount, no declarations to read, no fireworks lighting up the sky. There is just life. Simple, sometimes frustrating, often charming. Life that hums along like a familiar lullaby. And beneath it, the currents of change stir quietly. A farmer complains about taxes. A shopkeeper worries about imports. A blacksmith mutters under his breath about a new regulation. Someone in a tavern tells a story of a ship full of tea dumped into the harbor. It's subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it is there. The beginnings of rebellion, the stirrings of independence, the quiet first notes of a symphony that will soon crescendo. And if you listen closely, really closely, you can almost hear it in the wind that moves through the trees, in the chatter of the townsfolk, in the squeals of children chasing chickens, and in the rhythmic hammering of a blacksmith. A whisper that says something is coming. History does not explode. It brews, slowly, quietly, but with a purpose. And in the 13 colonies, that quiet brewing has begun. As the sun climbs higher in the sky, casting gentle light over farms, towns, and busy ports, we leave our colonial friends to their day. They plant, they bake, they work, they grumble. Life goes on. And while they may not know it yet, the age of revolution is quietly knocking at the door. But for now, they are living. And we, as gentle observers, take our first steps into this world, a world of simplicity, charm, and the beginnings of extraordinary change. The air in the 13 colonies had changed since the quiet mornings we visited last chapter. It wasn't loud or dramatic yet, no cannon fire, no armies marching. But beneath the everyday hum of life, there was a low rumble, like the soft growl of a distant storm. People felt it, some ignored it. Some whispered about it in taverns, at market stalls, or over kitchen tables while kneading dough. And the source of that rumble? Well, that's what we're about to explore. It all began with a war. Not a big one in the colonies themselves, but one that had shaken the world. The French and Indian War, fought between Britain and France, with Native American nations on both sides. It was messy, confusing, and expensive, kind of like when your neighbor borrows your lawnmower and returns it broken, but on a much, much larger scale. Britain won, yes, but the victory came with a price: mountains of debt. And as any parent, friend, or nation will tell you, when you're deep in debt, someone has to pay. In this case, it was the colonists. Britain, sitting across the Atlantic, thought, well, you did benefit from the war, didn't you? Time to chip in for the tab. And so began a string of taxes that would quietly, but steadily, irritate the colonists. The first was the Stamp Act. Imagine having to pay a small fee just to buy a piece of paper or to have a legal document. Birth certificates, newspapers, even playing cards needed stamps. Every letter or legal paper carried a tiny, invisible tax. Colonists grumbled, muttered, and rolled their eyes. It felt like someone charging you for every breath of fresh air you took. Annoying, unfair, and slightly absurd. But they were clever. They found ways around it. Smugglers smuggled, printers printed secretly, and tavern discussions became debates on the injustice of taxation without representation. Then came the Townshend Acts, taxing imported goods like glass, paint, paper, and tea. Again, small fees, but enough to make everyday life a little more expensive and slightly frustrating. And let's not forget the Tea Act, which made imported tea from Britain cheaper than local tea merchants could sell. Sounds good. Not really. Colonists saw it as a trick. Britain was trying to control them and push them into buying tea from the East India Company. And colonists, who loved their morning brew, were not going to be told what to drink. Tea had never tasted so political. All of this simmering tension occasionally boiled over into small, tense encounters. One of the most famous was the Boston Massacre. Picture a cold evening in Boston. Snowflakes drift down like soft confetti. Citizens are gathering, voices raised in frustration. British soldiers stand guard wary, and then in a flash things go wrong. Shots are fired. 5 colonists are killed. But here's the key. The moment was quickly used like a cautionary tale, a story told again and again in whispers, letters, and newspapers. Both sides painted it differently. Some said it was an attack. Others said it was a tragedy. But all agreed it left the colonies uneasy. A shadow had crossed the streets of Boston, and people felt fear mixed with anger. Not long after, a more theatrical act of defiance took place: the Boston Tea Party. Calm, almost playful in its audacity. Colonists, dressed as Native Americans to hide their identities, boarded ships under the cover of night and dumped chests of tea into the harbor. Imagine the quiet lapping of the waves, the soft creak of wooden planks, and then a splash. Tea everywhere. It was symbolic, cheeky, and, honestly, a little satisfying if you like seeing unfair taxes taken down a peg. The British were not amused, but the colonists, they felt a rush, a small, rebellious thrill. They were sending a message, quietly but clearly. We're watching, we're tired, and we will not be ignored. Emotionally, this period was a roller coaster, but a gentle, slow one. Colonists felt frustrated, yes, and a little scared. Fear of British power, fear of the unknown, fear of what their complaints might bring. And alongside that fear was a strange mix of hope and determination. They were learning slowly that their voices mattered, that even small acts, a paper, a pamphlet, a splash of tea, could ripple outward. They were discovering that history does not just happen in grand battles. It begins with quiet resistance, whispers, and small decisions. Britain, of course, noticed. And when you notice a simmering pot, you either let it boil over or try to tighten the lid. The Crown chose the lid. They sent more troops, enforced stricter laws, and tightened control over trade. Every act of defiance was met with a calculated response. More soldiers, more regulations, more restrictions. They didn't yet see that the colonies were learning how to push back. Gently, persistently, thoughtfully. It was like watching two dancers circle each other, careful not to step on toes, until the music changes and the dance becomes something entirely different. And this is where the beauty of history lies. It isn't sudden. It doesn't explode with a single moment. It builds, like the wind gathering over a field, unnoticed at first, or like dough quietly rising in a dark kitchen, smelling faintly of yeast and promise. The rumblings of rebellion were growing, yes, but quietly. Newspapers carried opinion pieces filled with subtle sarcasm. Pamphlets circulated, questioning the Crown and inspiring conversation. People held town meetings, sometimes heated, sometimes calm, trying to make sense of it all. They argued, they laughed, they feared, they hoped, and in homes, the everyday rhythms continued. Sarah kneaded dough, muttering about the price of paper and tea, while Thomas hammered iron, grumbling about taxes but finding satisfaction in shaping the metal with his own hands. Children ran barefoot through the streets, blissfully unaware of the political storm brewing just beyond their eyes. Everyone was part of it, knowingly or not. The personal and the political intertwined in small gestures, in conversations at dawn, over mugs of coffee or tea, in letters sent across counties. So here we are, standing quietly on the edge of history. We can hear the soft drumbeat in the distance, taxes, acts, clashes, and tea in the harbour. It's all very calm when compared to the loud, fiery revolution that is coming. But don't be fooled by the gentle tone. Every small event, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, is a piece of a larger puzzle. A puzzle that, when fully assembled, will lead to war, independence, and a new nation. And the colonists, bless them, are learning the most important lesson. Change often starts quietly. With murmurs in taverns, with small acts of defiance, with persistent curiosity. The spark is there, flickering softly, waiting for the wind to blow. And that wind is coming in the form of time, courage, and countless ordinary people who suddenly realize that life under distant control might just be negotiable, or maybe utterly unnecessary. So, we leave the 13 colonies here at this moment of quiet tension. No battles yet, No grand proclamations yet. Just people going about their lives, with hearts full of unease, minds pondering injustice, and hands ready to act, if the moment comes. And if we listen closely, we can hear it, the spark before the fire, the gentle stirrings of rebellion, the beginnings of a story that will one day echo across continents. Calm, reflective, and quietly powerful. Because history, you see, doesn't shout at first. It whispers, it lingers, it teases, and sometimes it spills tea into the harbor, just to make sure someone is paying attention. The night was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every little sound. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, even the occasional creak of a wooden shutter swaying in the wind. Somewhere in Massachusetts, a man rode through this calm, his horse's hooves tapping softly on the road. His name was Paul Revere, and while tonight might sound like any other night, it was far from ordinary. Paul's ride wasn't a casual trot through the countryside. It was a race against time. A whispering alarm meant to warn the colonies that something big was about to happen. Imagine it, Paul Revere, wrapped in a cloak that flapped like a flag in the wind, gripping the reins tightly, alert to every shadow and flicker of moonlight. He moved quietly, purposefully, alerting villagers in churches and homes, urging them to stay ready. "The British are coming," he said, not with panic, but with urgency, like someone nudging sleepy neighbors to hurry before a storm. And while it sounds dramatic when we tell it now, for those waking townsfolk, it was a strange mix of confusion, curiosity, and a little thrill. After all, how often do you get a midnight visitor galloping through your town announcing impending trouble? It's the kind of thing children would later whisper about by candlelight, imagining the cloak flapping in the wind and the horse's hooves pounding like a soft drumbeat in the night. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, tension hung in the air like morning mist. In the towns of Lexington and Concord, villagers rubbed sleepy eyes and adjusted shawls and hats, unsure exactly what the day would bring. Farmers paused in the fields, plow in hand, looking toward the distant road. Shopkeepers, tending to early customers, muttered under their breath about rumors and soldiers. And the soldiers themselves, British and colonial alike, were unsure. Each side was stepping cautiously into unknown territory, testing the waters, wondering how the other would react. Nobody knew that today the quiet would end. That today the first shots would echo across the countryside. The encounter in Lexington was swift but tense. Men in uniform faced villagers with a mix of authority and nervousness. Someone fired a shot. Nobody is exactly sure who, and that's part of the story. But that shot, gentle as it may have seemed to those far away, became legendary. The shot heard round the world. And while it sounds like something from a movie, for the people there, it was terrifying and confusing, like an unexpected clap of thunder on a clear morning. Villagers ducked behind fences, eyes wide. Soldiers tensed, unsure of what would come next. Horses whinnied, chickens scattered, and somewhere a cat probably ran up a tree, judging humans as usual. After Lexington, the conflict quietly spilled into Concord. Homes and barns became part of a delicate, tense dance. Shots were exchanged, muskets cracked, and the countryside was suddenly alive with movement. But even amid the chaos, this was not the Hollywood style battle we might imagine. It was small, personal, almost intimate. Every villager felt the uncertainty. Every soldier felt it too. Ordinary people, going about their day, suddenly found themselves actors in history. The emotional weight was palpable: fear, confusion, and a strange sort of pride mixed together. They were witnessing and participating in something that would be told and retold for centuries. Meanwhile, news traveled fast. Relatively speaking, for 1775, messengers on horseback, carrying letters and verbal reports, moved from town to town. By the time evening rolled around, whispers had become stories, and stories had become warnings. Communities that had been calm the night before now buzzed with anticipation and worry. Families huddled by fires, discussing what this meant for them, their neighbors, and their children. No one could be certain what the next day would bring, and that uncertainty made hearts beat a little faster. Back in Philadelphia, a different kind of gathering was happening. The Second Continental Congress convened, bringing together representatives from each colony. These were not soldiers, not men brandishing weapons. They were thinkers, planners, and worried citizens who understood that calm discussions now might shape the entire future. They debated, argued, and considered options: independence, reconciliation, defensive preparations. Each choice felt heavy, like holding a fragile vase that could shatter if you weren't careful. And all the while, they were aware that the world outside, the countryside, the towns, the farms, was beginning to stir with tension and unrest. Their decisions, quiet and thoughtful, would ripple across the colonies like gentle waves in a pond, eventually growing into the tidal force of revolution. The mood of the colonies at this time was a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope. Some colonists feared the worst: British retaliation, loss of property, danger to their families. Others saw the moment as an opportunity, a chance to claim rights, voice grievances, and begin the slow work of building a more just society. And even amid fear, there was a peculiar sense of humor that persisted. Villagers joked nervously about hiding behind fences, about dodging soldiers, and about the absurdity of suddenly being part of what felt like a very serious, very dramatic story. It's the kind of humor that only comes from facing uncertainty, small, human, and quietly comforting. Even the natural world seemed to participate in this delicate moment. Birds kept their songs low, as if to avoid disturbing the drama unfolding below. Fog clung to the hillsides, softening sounds and blurring the edges of fences and houses. The morning sun rose slowly, casting gentle light over a landscape poised between ordinary life and extraordinary change. Life continued in its quiet rhythm. Chickens pecked at grain, farmers tended their crops, shopkeepers swept the sidewalks. But now each step, each glance, carried the weight of possibility. And so, the colonies stood at the threshold of war, not yet fully engulfed, but no longer entirely safe in the old routines. Small actions, quiet messages, and whispered warnings had transformed everyday life into a stage for history. The night ride of Paul Revere, the tension in Lexington, the skirmishes in Concord, and the thoughtful debates in Philadelphia. All of these threads wove together, gradually tightening the fabric of revolution. The moment had arrived. The threshold had been crossed. Change was no longer distant. It was here. As night fell again, the countryside exhaled. Villagers returned to their homes, nervous but determined. Families sat by candlelight, listening to the soft crackle of firewood and the low hum of conversation. Outside, the stars twinkled quietly, like distant eyes watching over the unfolding story. And in the hearts of those ordinary people, farmers, shopkeepers, messengers, and soldiers, a new understanding was settling that life was about to change in ways no one could fully imagine. And as we leave this chapter, we can imagine the soft, anxious breathing of a nation on the brink. The first shots have been fired, but the war has only just begun. The night is calm, the roads are quiet, and yet the rhythm of history moves forward, softly, steadily, like a heartbeat you can just barely hear, but that keeps time for everyone who is about to live through it. Because this is the moment when ordinary life meets extraordinary history. When quiet villages become the stage for a story that will echo through centuries. When the threshold of war is crossed, not with fanfare, but with uncertainty, courage, and a little bit of chaos. Just enough to keep things interesting. And in that quiet, dark night, with horses' hooves fading in the distance and villagers holding their breath, the American Revolution truly begins. The candlelight flickered softly in the halls of Philadelphia, casting long, warm shadows over polished wooden benches. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that invites careful thought, the kind that makes even the creak of a chair sound important. Men in powdered wigs shuffled papers, whispered to one another, and tapped quills against the desk as if testing the rhythm of history itself. This was the Second Continental Congress, and they were about to consider a question that weighed heavily on every mind in the room. Should the colonies declare independence from Britain? It might sound dramatic, because it was, but inside the candlelit halls, the atmosphere was surprisingly calm. These men weren't storming into battle. They were arguing, debating, and occasionally sighing heavily. Imagine a room full of people, some nervously fidgeting, some stroking their beards, some glancing out the window at the quiet city streets below. And amid the seriousness, there was humor too. A whispered joke about a stubborn quill that wouldn't cooperate, or a man who had accidentally spilled ink on his wig. It was human. It was real. It was the gentle rhythm of history unfolding. At the center of all this was a young man named Thomas Jefferson. A tall, thoughtful figure. He spent long nights hunched over a desk in a small room, quill in hand, working by candlelight. The ink flowed slowly, sometimes blotting, sometimes skipping, as he wrestled with words that might shape the future. He wanted the document to be clear, to inspire, and to express the hopes and frustrations of millions who could not be in that room. The Declaration of Independence was not just words on paper. It was a careful, deliberate attempt to give voice to a quiet longing that had been growing in the colonies for years. Jefferson wrote about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, concepts that today we read easily but which, at the time, carried enormous weight. These were ideas born of careful thought, reflection, and a deep understanding that the people deserved a government that served them, not the other way around. Every sentence mattered. Every word was chosen slowly, like a painter selecting colors for a sunrise. And in the quiet of those nights, Jefferson's hand traced the vision of a new nation. Not perfect, not simple, but hopeful. While Jefferson wrote, the Congress debated. Gentle voices rose and fell like soft waves. Some men worried about angering Britain, about the dangers of rebellion, about families who might be caught in the middle. Others argued with conviction, speaking softly but firmly, about justice, fairness, and the right to govern themselves. The debates could be long and careful. Sometimes the men would pause to sip tea or nibble a biscuit, quietly collecting their thoughts. And sometimes, when a particularly stubborn idea was proposed, a soft chuckle would ripple through the room. Proof that even in the weightiest moments, humans remain human. The document grew slowly, line by line. Its words were carefully considered. All men are created equal. They are endowed with certain unalienable rights. Words like freedom, justice, and consent weren't just abstract ideas. They were promises, hopes, and warnings rolled into one. Jefferson wanted the document to inspire, to persuade, and to mark a clear turning point in history. Every word carried the emotional weight of an entire continent's dreams and fears. Finally, after long nights and quiet reflection, the day arrived for the declaration to be presented and signed. Imagine the hall again, lit by soft sunlight streaming through tall windows, warming the polished wood. The men gathered, some nervous, some determined, some simply amazed that they had reached this moment. And then, slowly, deliberately, the pens scratched across paper. One by one, the signers added their names, knowing that their signatures represented a commitment unlike any they had made before. They were, in that moment, linking themselves to an idea bigger than themselves, to liberty, to change, and to the possibility of a new world. The signing itself was calm, almost reverent. No fireworks, no cheering crowds, no dramatic music. Just the soft scratch of ink on paper, the gentle rustle of clothing, and the collective inhale of a group of people fully aware of the weight of what they were doing. It was a quiet revolution in both thought and action, and though they could not know exactly what the future held, they felt the quiet thrill of possibility. Emotionally, the moment was heavy, full of hope and doubt. Fear lingered like a shadow, fear of British retaliation, fear of failure, fear for family and friends. But alongside that fear was a quiet excitement. This was an opportunity to shape the future, to act on principles they had long considered, to take the first step towards something extraordinary. They were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, aware that every choice, every word, every signature mattered. Meanwhile, outside in Philadelphia, life continued. Children played in the streets, shopkeepers opened doors to early customers, and farmers tended to nearby fields. Unseen by them, history was being made inside those halls. It's strange, when you think about it, that the world can shift so profoundly, quietly, while everyday life hums along as usual. And perhaps that's the gentle lesson of this chapter. Revolutionary change often happens slowly, thoughtfully, and with as much reflection as action. Even the atmosphere seemed to carry the weight of these ideas. The sunlight warmed the wooden floors, the smell of ink and paper lingered in the air, and the faint creak of benches under shifting weight punctuated the quiet. Everything was deliberate, everything was soft, and yet, beneath the calm, a ripple of energy spread outward, beyond the walls of the hall, beyond Philadelphia, toward towns, farms, and villages across the colonies. Ideas were traveling faster than messengers, spreading through whispers, readings, and conversations in homes and taverns. In the following days and weeks, the declaration would be read aloud in towns and cities, bringing the words and vision of independence to people who had never held a quill. The impact was subtle at first. Small conversations, quiet smiles, thoughtful nods. But slowly, like a gentle tide, the ideas took hold. People began to imagine life differently. They imagined liberty, fairness, and the possibility of a government that served them, not the other way around. And so, as we leave the candlelit halls of Philadelphia, we carry with us the quiet inspiration of that moment. Independence was no longer just a thought or a hope. It was now a tangible idea, written in ink, endorsed by ordinary people taking extraordinary steps. History had shifted slightly, and the air of possibility floated gently through the 13 colonies. Because history, when it's done thoughtfully and patiently, is both calming and powerful. It doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers. And in those whispers, the debates, the quiet drafting, the soft signing of a document, we see the birth of something extraordinary, something worth remembering, something worth telling as a story that can soothe, inspire, and remind us that change, even the most profound change, often begins softly with a few thoughtful words and brave hearts. And for a moment, as the candles flickered and the quills rested, the world seemed to hold its breath, aware that the idea of independence, once just a quiet thought in the minds of a few, had now become a promise to a continent. The morning sun rose slowly over the 13 colonies, but life no longer felt peaceful. The rumble of rebellion had grown into the soft, steady drumbeat of war. It wasn't dramatic fireworks or thrilling heroics that marked the days. It was mud cold, exhaustion, and quiet courage. For the ordinary people and soldiers living through it, every day felt like a long stretch of endurance, with small victories and endless frustrations. At the start, the colonies were not well organized. Militias gathered in makeshift camps, sometimes lacking proper supplies or uniforms. Soldiers huddled under blankets in the cold, trying to stay warm while their stomachs rumbled from meager rations. Muskets were old, powder damp, and boots wore thin on muddy roads. It was messy, confusing, and exhausting, but life had a way of moving forward, even amid chaos. Imagine a campfire flickering softly in the night, a group of soldiers leaning close, quietly sharing bread and stories, and trying not to shiver too hard. There was fear, yes, but also determination, the steady kind that doesn't shout but keeps going anyway. George Washington emerged in this chaos as a steady, calming presence. He wasn't a superhero or a lightning-striking figure. He was a man who rose early, rode long hours, and listened carefully to advice and complaints. Soldiers often said that just seeing him calmly move among the tents and trenches gave them confidence, not because he was fearless, but because he never let panic show. He had a quiet sort of bravery, the kind that keeps everyone moving forward, even when nothing seems certain. You could almost imagine him taking a deep breath, adjusting his hat, and muttering, "Well, we'll get through today too," before checking on another unit. Life for soldiers was harsh, but it was also human. Nights were long and cold, often spent under simple tents or even the open sky. Fires crackled softly, casting dancing shadows, while letters were written home by candlelight. These letters were full of longing, small jokes, and quiet reflections. "Miss you all," one soldier would write. "The soup is terrible, but at least it's hot." Another might add, "Humor was tiny, but it helped." It reminded soldiers that they were still human, not just pieces in a chessboard of war. The battles themselves, though important, were often more about patience and strategy than dramatic heroics. Skirmishes were small, moves cautious, and victories hard-earned. Places like Bunker Hill, Trenton, and Princeton were fought with intensity, but also with careful calculation. The soldiers learned slowly that battles were as much about endurance, supply lines, and morale as they were about fighting. Each encounter left weariness in its wake. Tired bodies, muddied uniforms, and exhausted minds. But also quiet lessons learned for the future. Early losses were common, and morale sometimes dipped. Armies went hungry, winter was cruel, and some days it felt like progress was impossible. Soldiers trudged through snow, trudged through mud, and trudged through disappointment, each step taken with effort and grit. Yet even on these days life persisted. Chickens clucked in nearby yards, streams gurgled past camps, and the sun rose again, casting light on frost-covered fields. It was the small, persistent rhythms of life that gave hope, even in the middle of such uncertainty. George Washington and his officers encouraged letters home, helping soldiers maintain connections with families and friends. These letters were a lifeline, a reminder of why they endured. "Tell mother I am well," a young soldier wrote, and yes, I did manage not to fall in the mud today. Small moments like this, letters, jokes, shared warmth by the fire, carried the weight of the war in ways that grand speeches never could. The war was long, sometimes painfully slow, months blurred together, punctuated by skirmishes, marches, and brief camps. Every small victory was a relief, every setback a quiet heartbreak. Soldiers and civilians alike learned patience, endurance, and the strange comfort of routine in chaos. It was not the kind of story with dramatic explosions and instant triumphs. It was a story of resilience, subtle courage, and quiet hope. Amid all this, ordinary people were affected in ways both large and small. Farmers might lose crops or livestock, families had to ration food, towns had to manage trade and supply routes carefully. Children watched from the sidelines, sometimes scared, sometimes curious. Life didn't stop for war, but it shifted. Every day was a balancing act, survival, duty, and the hope that one day the war would end and the world would feel normal again. And yet, even in the darkness and uncertainty, moments of human warmth appeared. Soldiers shared stolen moments of laughter, a warm loaf of bread, or a shared blanket under the cold stars. Civilians helped in quiet ways, sending food, tending the sick, or simply listening to the worries of neighbors. The war could not erase the ordinary acts of kindness that stitched communities together, reminding everyone that humanity persisted even in hardship. By the end of each long day, soldiers and civilians alike might pause to watch the sunset, letting the warm colors wash over them. Even in war, there was beauty. Even in struggle, there was hope. And sometimes that was enough. The war had begun as a series of small frustrations and skirmishes. It had grown into months and years of uncertainty. Yet, through it all, life continued, quietly teaching lessons about endurance, patience, and the power of ordinary people to carry the weight of extraordinary circumstances. History often romanticizes war, painting it as grand and heroic. But the real story, as anyone who lived it would tell you, was quieter, slower, and far more human. It was about soldiers shivering in tents, writing letters by candlelight, farmers protecting what little they had, and leaders like Washington calmly guiding them through the storm. It was about hope, small victories, and the knowledge that endurance mattered as much as courage. And so, as we leave this chapter, we see the American Revolution not as a sudden blaze, but as a slow, persistent fire. It is a fire carried in the hearts of ordinary people, fueled by daily acts of bravery and perseverance. It is the rhythm of life in wartime cold nights, quiet camps, muddied boots, letters home, and the steady leadership of those who inspire without shouting. It is melancholic, yes, but peaceful, because history, in its gentlest form, teaches us this. Even in long, exhausting, and uncertain times, hope can exist. Courage can persist, and ordinary humans can endure hardships that might seem overwhelming, one quiet day at a time. And tonight, as we imagine those soldiers by the campfire, letters in hand, and Washington riding quietly among them, we can rest easy in the knowledge that even in uncertainty, life continues. That small acts, writing a letter, sharing a loaf of bread, keeping warm in the snow, shape the rhythm of history. And that, sometimes, the greatest victories are not loud or immediate, but quiet, enduring, and deeply human. While soldiers trudged through muddy fields and cold camps in the colonies, far across the ocean, a very different kind of work was quietly underway. In salons and drawing rooms of Paris, Benjamin Franklin charmed the French elite with his calm wit, twinkling eyes, and sometimes playful antics. He wasn't waving a musket or commanding troops, he was offering smiles, conversations, and a clever way to make people listen. France, a country of art, wine, and long dinners, was intrigued. And Franklin, with his soft humor and gentle intelligence, became a quiet bridge between worlds. Imagine Franklin at a dinner party, sipping coffee, adjusting his spectacles, telling a clever story about life in the colonies. He laughed with his hosts, offered small jokes about British manners, and slowly, patiently, made the case for why France might want to support a distant rebellion. He didn't shout. He didn't demand. He suggested, persuaded, and charmed. Diplomacy, in this way, was as much about personality as politics, and Franklin had both in quiet abundance. France's decision to help was not immediate. It took months of observation, deliberation, and careful calculation. They watched the colonies, noting victories and losses, reading letters, and listening to reports carried by messengers across the sea. But when the turning point came, the victory at Saratoga, the mood shifted. Saratoga was not a massive, dramatic explosion of battle, but rather a steady, decisive moment that quietly signaled that the American cause was real, possible, and worth supporting. The French, once hesitant, now leaned in. Their ships, troops, and money would soon flow into the conflict, bringing a gentle but vital lift to weary soldiers and hopeful civilians alike. Back in the colonies, news of Saratoga traveled slowly, but when it arrived, it carried a wave of relief. After years of struggle, cold winters, and uncertainty, the victory brought hope. Soldiers in the camps shared smiles. Families whispered prayers of gratitude, and leaders breathed a little easier. The tide was beginning to turn, not with thunder, but with the quiet confidence that comes from seeing persistence rewarded. And the alliance with France was more than just military support. It was a signal to the colonies that the world was paying attention, that they were not alone, and that their quiet struggle had meaning beyond their borders. International politics, though often distant and complex, shaped the war in ways that were quietly profound. Letters exchanged across oceans, treaties drafted in ornate rooms, and conversations over tea and wine in foreign salons all influenced the rhythm of battles back home. A ship carrying French soldiers might arrive months after the ink dried on a treaty, and yet its presence could change the morale of an entire army. A promise of support, whispered in the right drawing room, could ripple across continents, lifting spirits in ways that cannon fire alone could never do. Life for ordinary people continued amid this growing optimism. In towns and farms, news arrived gradually, sometimes carried by a neighbor on horseback, sometimes by letters read aloud in the marketplace. Children listened with wide eyes as parents shared stories of the turning tide. Shopkeepers and farmers smiled quietly at each other, feeling that, finally, months and years of struggle might bear fruit. Even soldiers in camp paused to note that reinforcements might be coming, that supplies could be better, and that the distant world was beginning to care about their daily hardships. Franklin's diplomacy, the French support, and the victory at Saratoga all carried subtle lessons about patience, persistence, and the value of quiet effort. Nothing happened overnight. Nothing was immediate. The success was the result of careful planning, personal charm, and the steady courage of ordinary people on both sides of the ocean. It's a reminder that even in a world dominated by conflict, soft skills, relationships, and human connection can influence history just as much as strategy or force. The alliance with France brought more than just troops and money. It brought emotional lift. After years of cold nights, meager rations, and endless uncertainty, soldiers and civilians alike felt a gentle warmth spread through their hearts. The struggle, while still ongoing, suddenly seemed less impossible. They were not alone. Others across oceans cared enough to help. And in that realization there was hope, like the first sunray breaking through a cloudy morning after a long winter. Back in France, Franklin continued his work quietly, attending meetings, hosting dinners, and writing letters with careful humor. He knew that the war was about more than muskets or strategy. It was about trust, relationships, and belief. And he understood that patience, charm, and small acts could ripple across time. Every story he told, every smile he offered, and every argument he made gently nudged history in a hopeful direction. Meanwhile, in the colonies, people continued to endure the war's hardships. Winter still came, supplies still ran short, and uncertainty lingered like morning fog. But with the knowledge that allies were watching and ready to help, their steps felt lighter. Farmers tilled the soil with slightly more optimism. Soldiers shared stories by campfires with quieter fear. Families whispered their hopes with gentle laughter. Even the smallest gestures, a loaf of bread shared, a letter delivered, a warm fire tended, carried extra meaning now because they were part of a larger, hopeful story. And so, as we leave this chapter, the mood is expansive yet calm. The colonies are still in the midst of war, but the horizon looks wider. Alliances, diplomacy, and turning points are quietly reshaping the future. History is no longer just the domain of soldiers and generals. It is now a story that stretches across continents, carried in letters, conversations, and gentle acts of support. Because sometimes, the most profound moments of change do not roar. They arrive softly, patiently, and steadily. Like Franklin's quiet diplomacy, like the careful support of allies, like a distant victory that lifts hearts without fanfare. These moments remind us that even amid struggle and uncertainty, hope persists. And when hope persists, ordinary people continue, quietly shaping history one day at a time. Tonight, as the candles flicker in Parisian salons and fires crackle in colonial camps, we can rest easy knowing that the world is beginning to pay attention. That support, however gentle or delayed, can bring strength after long hardship. That perseverance, patience, and small acts of connection can quietly change the course of events. And in that calm, hopeful light, we glimpse the subtle power of humanity, working across oceans, through winter nights, and amid quiet camps, to lift the hearts of a weary but determined people. The morning sun rose softly over Yorktown, casting long, gentle shadows across the fields. The British Army, led by General Cornwallis, was tired. Months of marching, skirmishing, and enduring the unpredictability of war had left them weary. Soldiers adjusted their hats, rubbed sore shoulders, and quietly tended to small tasks. The tension was there, yes, but it wasn't the kind of dramatic chaos stories often suggest. It was a calm, patient, almost tired waiting. Across the fields, George Washington's army approached with steady purpose. The siege was not a dramatic storming of walls or loud fanfare. It was careful, methodical strategy, like slowly assembling pieces of a puzzle, one thoughtful move at a time. Cannons were placed thoughtfully, troops positioned quietly, and plans discussed in hushed tones around campfires. Washington's patience was his strength, and the soldiers trusted him not because he shouted or demanded, but because he moved steadily with calm attention to detail. Yorktown became a stage for quiet endurance. The British held their positions, the Americans advanced slowly, and the French Navy circled offshore, a gentle but decisive presence. Each day passed with measured actions, small adjustments, and careful observation. Soldiers wrote letters home, noting the odd humor in camp life, even as the situation grew serious. Cornwallis looks more tired than us today, one letter might read. Or, we have mud in our boots again, but at least the sun is out. Small observations like these remind us that history is lived by humans, in real time, with ordinary thoughts and feelings. Finally, the moment came. Cornwallis, realizing that further resistance was futile, prepared to surrender. The ceremony was quiet, respectful, and deliberate. Soldiers laid down their arms, officers exchanged polite nods, and there were no dramatic shouts or triumphant fanfares. It was a gentle acknowledgement that the long, exhausting conflict was over, at least in this place. Washington accepted the surrender with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout the war, aware of the significance, but not seeking spectacle. As news of Yorktown spread, the sense of relief rippled across the colonies. Families hugged quietly, children listened in awe as the story reached their towns, and soldiers exhaled after years of hardship. The end of the war was not about grand celebration in the streets. It was about collective relief. People felt the weight of years lift gently from their shoulders, and for a moment, the quiet promise of peace replaced the daily anxieties of survival. The final act, however, was not only on the battlefield. Across oceans, diplomats worked patiently to formalize the end of conflict. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, marked the official conclusion. Negotiators in calm rooms, quills in hand, discussed borders, trade, and sovereignty with care. It was slow, deliberate, and quiet work, but it was essential. The treaty confirmed what soldiers and civilians had already sensed: the war, with all its hardships, had drawn to a close. And in that calm diplomacy, a new nation quietly took its first formal breath. This final chapter of the revolution was not about heroics alone. It was about patience, endurance, and humanity. Soldiers cleaned muskets, repaired tents, and wrote final letters. Families tended farms that had survived the chaos. Leaders reflected on years of decisions made in candlelit halls and open fields. And somewhere in quiet towns and homes, people simply sat and let themselves believe in the possibility of peace. Even the natural world seemed to participate in this gentle closure. Birds chirped softly in the morning, the sun-warmed fields still dotted with tents, and the rivers carried reflections of calm skies. Life, in its ordinary rhythms, resumed alongside history. Children played where soldiers had marched, shopkeepers reopened doors, and farmers returned to the steady work of planting and harvesting. The war had been long, exhausting, and uncertain, but now a gentle order began to reassert itself. Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris remind us that endings are often quiet. They are not always marked by loud music or fireworks. Sometimes endings are simple nods, polite exchanges, and moments of human relief. People breathe out, let go of fears, and allow themselves to rest. The revolution, which had begun with whispers, debates, and the soft scratch of a quill, concluded in the same spirit, patiently, calmly, and thoughtfully. And yet, the emotional weight of this closure was profound. Soldiers who had endured cold nights and muddy fields felt a quiet pride. Families who had faced uncertainty for years exhaled with relief. Leaders who had carried the heavy burden of decision experienced the gentle satisfaction of work completed. There was hope now, yes, but it was soft, reflective hope, not loud triumph. The war had shaped a people, and the first steps of a nation were about to be taken in a quiet, deliberate world. As we leave Yorktown and the Treaty of Paris behind, we can imagine the gentle rhythm of life returning. Soldiers returned home, not as conquering heroes, but as tired humans who had endured. Towns and cities resumed their daily routines. Children laughed softly in streets, once filled with anxious whispers, and the long shadow of uncertainty began to lift. History, in this moment, teaches that closure does not always roar. It breathes quietly, settles gently, and allows space for new beginnings. The revolution was over, but its lessons lingered. Patience, calm strategy, endurance, and quiet courage had carried ordinary humans through extraordinary times. And as the sun set softly over the colonies, a sense of peace, relief, and gentle anticipation filled the air. The journey had been long, the struggle had been real. But now, at last, there was quiet closure. And tonight, as we imagine soldiers tucking into soft beds instead of tents, families sitting by warm fires, and leaders walking slowly through empty halls, we can rest in the gentle knowledge that a chapter of history has ended. Not with a dramatic shout, but with calm, respectful resolution. A final act that honors the journey, the hardships, and the humanity of everyone who lived through it. The guns had fallen silent. The campfires were cold, and the long shadow of war was slowly lifting from the 13 colonies. But peace did not arrive like a sudden sunrise. Instead, it was soft, tentative, like the first morning light brushing over fields still dotted with memories of the past. Life after the war was uncertain. People returned to farms and shops, hoping for stability, but aware that the world had changed, and so had they. Soldiers shuffled home, boots still dusty, letters in hand, and hearts full of mixed emotions. Families reunited with hugs, laughter, and tears, while neighbors quietly shared stories of survival and small triumphs. There was hope, yes, but also fragility. Some towns had been damaged, crops lost, and lives disrupted. The rhythm of normal life returned slowly, like a gentle stream rejoining a river after a flood. People learned to savor small things, a warm meal, a sturdy roof, or the quiet sound of children playing outside once more. Even as peace settled, a new challenge emerged. How do you build a government from scratch? How do ordinary people, who had fought for independence, now agree on rules, rights, and responsibilities? The answer was not simple, and it required patience, compromise, and quiet reflection. Leaders gathered in quiet rooms, discussing ideas, sometimes disagreeing, sometimes pausing to sip tea or nibble bread. The Constitution began to take shape. A document that would guide the new nation, slowly, deliberately, like planting seeds that would grow over decades. The early days of unity were tender and fragile. The states were independent, proud, and occasionally stubborn. Citizens had fought to escape distant rule, and now they had to learn to share power, to listen, and to balance competing interests. It was a slow process, filled with small victories and gentle setbacks, and through it all, humor persisted. One can imagine a delegate adjusting his wig and joking about the difficulty of agreeing on punctuation, or a neighbor quietly laughing at the endless debates over whether a comma could change the fate of a nation. These tiny, human moments remind us that even serious work is done by ordinary people with ordinary quirks. The American Revolution, though over in a military sense, did not truly end. Ideas, once sparked, have a way of evolving. The dream of liberty, fairness, and self-determination continued to grow, not just in the United States, but around the world. Countries far away observed quietly, learning from the courage, mistakes, and persistence of people who had dared to imagine something different. Revolutions, in this sense, are like rivers. They may bend, pause, or flow quietly, but they never stop moving entirely. Daily life slowly regained its rhythm. Farmers tended fields with renewed purpose, shopkeepers opened doors with cautious optimism, and children played in the streets, unaware of the debates that had shaped the world around them. Families found joy in small routines, the morning coffee, the sound of laughter, the smell of bread baking. And amid these ordinary moments, the lessons of the revolution quietly took root. People learned patience, compromise, and the quiet courage to act for what they believed was right. The Constitution, drafted with care and compromise, became a gentle framework for governance. It was not perfect, and it required revision and interpretation over the years, but it provided a starting point, a soft, steady foundation on which a new nation could build. Delegates debated, negotiated, and listened, learning slowly that freedom and order must coexist delicately. And citizens, for their part, began to experience a new kind of responsibility. The understanding that liberty is maintained not only by leaders, but by ordinary people participating thoughtfully in daily life. The influence of the revolution reached beyond the borders of the new nation. People across Europe, and eventually other continents, heard whispers of the American experiment. The quiet idea that ordinary people could shape their government, defend their rights, and insist on justice inspired movements, debates, and dreams in distant lands. It is a reminder that the power of ideas can travel quietly, softly nudging the world toward change without fanfare or force. As we reflect on this time, the message is calm but profound. The revolution was not just a series of battles or speeches. It was a patient unfolding of hope, courage, and human perseverance. Ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances, shaped history gently but decisively. Their victories were not always loud or immediate, but they were enduring. And in that quiet endurance lies a lesson that resonates beyond time. Ideas, hope, and persistence can change the world, one small step at a time. Tonight, as we imagine families gathering around hearths, soldiers walking quietly through fields now free from conflict, and leaders drafting laws by candlelight, we can feel the calm of a world beginning to heal. The story of the revolution winds down gently, like the soft closing of a book, leaving behind warmth, reflection, and the gentle hum of possibility. And so, as this chapter and our story comes to a close, we rest in the quiet knowledge that revolutions do not simply end. They evolve. They continue in the ideas passed from person to person, in the small choices made daily, in the gentle work of building a society that reflects hope, fairness, and perseverance. History, when told softly, reminds us that even in the most uncertain and fragile times, life continues, people endure, ideas grow, and the gentle rhythm of hope carries us forward, quietly shaping the world for generations to come. And as the night draws in, with stars twinkling softly above, we can imagine a young nation dreaming, small yet bright, fragile yet determined. A nation that survived war, nurtured peace, and whispered softly to the world, "We are here, and we will try." Because sometimes, the greatest legacies are not loud declarations or dramatic victories, but quiet perseverance, calm reflection, and the enduring power of hope.